welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance. In episode 245, I asked you to send me your stories of messages from loved ones in the spirit world, and many of you followed through. So what you're about to hear today is part 1 of stories of messages from past loved ones. If you sent in a story and you don't hear it today, it'll be in part 2. There's still room for more stories too. And I'll even do a part 3 if we want it. So if you've been dragging your feet or trying to decide if you want to send one in, I'd love to share it. The instructions for how to do that will be in the show notes for this episode, or you can visit bigseance.com/247 to learn how. So today we're going to hear from Ayla, Bruce, Melissa, and Sherri. And just so I don't forget later, I want to thank each of you for being brave and vulnerable enough to share them, and for trusting us with your stories. We're only going to hear from 4 listeners today because, as you're about to learn, Ayla has a lot to share with you. So much that it's the majority of the episode, and I think it's beautiful. And she's up first. So I'll see you on the other side. No pun intended.
Hi, Patrick. This is Ayla, and I wanted to kind of give you a few stories about the visitations that I received and continue to receive from my father. To start, he passed away in September of 2011, and I was just 18, and I had graduated high school a couple months prior. Him and I had been pretty close, but not nearly as close as I probably should have been, but that is being a teenager, I suppose. When he passed away, it was unexpectedly. He was just shy 1 month of turning 51. So it was unexpected and really devastating. But I got through it. And his visitations to me started pretty soon after his passing. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. He passed away from like an unexpected heart attack. So I didn't know it was coming, and I didn't really have a good chance to say goodbye. But so a few months after his passing, I had always been a really vivid dreamer, but I was never able to vocalize in any of my dreams. So anyway, one night as I was sleeping, I had a very vivid dream of my dad. And he was looking at me, and he was younger, as I knew him when I was probably 10, 11. And it was just him, and he was looking at me, and he smiled. And all he said was, "I love you." And like I said, I was never able to vocalize in any of my dreams in the past. But in this dream, I said, "I love you too." And that was the end of that first dream. The second time he came to me in my dream, he was flying by me in my car. So I was driving, just going somewhere, and I look out my driver's side window and I see him, and he's just flying along beside me and he looked at me and smiled. And I got the most beautiful sense of peace, like he was watching over me and that he'll be with me. And that dream ended. And I just remember waking up and feeling really safe. But he came to me a third time in my dream. And this is the one that I might cherish the most. And that's kind of shaped my view on what happens after we die and where we go. So the dream I had, it starts out with me and my sister. We are under this beautiful, large oak tree, and we're younger, but we grab our hands together and we start spinning like kids do to get dizzy. And we're holding on to each other and we're spinning under this beautiful oak tree. And we stop spinning, we let go, we steady ourselves. And our father slowly walks up to us. And in the distance, I can see blurred people, but even though I couldn't see their faces, I just had this sense of knowing that those were my past loved ones there as well. But our dad walks up to us and there's no dialogue, but he walks us over to this edge of the earth that we were on that looks over this beautiful faraway beach. And everything is just golden and bright. And I can see the pier, and I can see people walking on the sand of the beach. And I can see the sunset and the waves. And there was just this sense of peace and oneness and knowing that he's okay and that we'll be okay and that everyone is eventually okay and that's heaven. And it was just the most beautiful dream. All of these dreams were just so beautiful and so simple, but they spoke volumes without saying anything. And they've touched me in such a way. It's shaped my entire outlook on life. And it's, in a way, brought me closer to my dad in death than I was when he was living, which I think is both really beautiful but really sad. But it's helped me appreciate the people that I love in my life now while they're living and kind of understand that things aren't permanent, but that it's not just blackness when we pass. But he's visited me in those dreams, but he's also visited me several times, more times than I can count, while I'm sleeping. He wakes me up. So the very first time that I felt him, I was moving out of my apartment in Boynton Beach, and my mother and my two sisters were in my apartment with me for the weekend to help me pack up and move some of my stuff to where I was moving. I still had work, but they were there to help me while I was working. And so my mother is in the kitchen cooking, and my two sisters are in my living room watching TV. The TV is on, and I can hear my mom cooking on the stove, banging stuff around, closing cabinets. And I let them all know that I'm going to go take a shower, and then I'm going to go lay down and just close my eyes before I actually go to bed. And my mom at the time was supposed to sleep with me in my bed, and my sisters were supposed to have the couch. So I let my mom know that once I'm done showering, don't worry about waking me up. I'm just going to lay down. But don't worry, you can come in whenever you're ready and lay down whenever you're ready for bed. So I do that. I take a shower and I get dressed and I lay down in bed, and I'm laying on my left side facing the middle of the bed. And it's less than a minute that I'm laying down, and I just closed my eyes and I can still hear my mom cooking in the kitchen and banging cabinets and dishes and running water. And I can hear the TV and my sisters. But then I start to feel someone climb into bed with me from the foot of my bed, and I can feel them crawling to lay down next to me. And so vividly, I can feel them getting into position, laying on their right side facing me, and their hand pressing down next to mine on the bed. And I keep my eyes closed because for a minute, I think it's my mother trying to slowly get into bed and not wake me, but to lay down. And as all of this is happening within a second, I let my mom know with my eyes still closed. It's okay. I just closed my eyes. I just laid down a minute ago. You're not waking me. Silence. But I can still hear the TV in the background and cooking in the kitchen. And I wonder why my mom isn't answering me. And then I open my eyes and there's no one. And I'm a little freaked out. But then I run into the kitchen and the living room and I ask my mom, why didn't you answer me? Why'd you get up out of bed so quickly? You know, you didn't wake me. And she looks at me confused. And I say, didn't you just lay down in bed with me? And she shakes her head and says, no, I was in the kitchen the whole time. And I look at my two sisters and I ask them, did you guys even just come in here for a moment and lay down? And they both say, no, we've been here this whole time. And I'm kind of in disbelief, and I'm looking at my mom and I tell her what just happened, and she looks at me kind of with some sad eyes, and she tells me that that was just my dad coming to visit. And I was shocked. That was one of the first times I ever had felt that as an adult. And from there, I move in with my mom, my sisters, the rest of my family. And a few months pass and I'm sleeping and I wake up just for a moment and I'm aware that I'm awake and I can hear silence. My dog Mika is laying in bed with me at my feet and I feel this hand on my shoulder. And I believe that it was my mom trying to wake me, but nicely and gently, as mothers usually do. But usually she'll put her hand on my arm and gently rub it and say my name, just to not startle me awake. And I wonder, I'm sitting here and I'm laying in bed wondering why she isn't moving, why she isn't trying to wake me up or say my name, and why she just has her hand cusped on my shoulder. And I open my eyes, and the feeling is still there on my shoulder. And I just lay there for a moment trying to understand what I'm feeling and why my mom isn't waking me completely. But then I get a little nervous and I finally think, okay, she must want me to wake up. So I turn around, I turn my light on, and there's no one in the room with me. And at this time, things like this, the touching, it frightened me because it was happening so often. And it was pretty shortly, about a year and a half after my father passed away. And it had really amplified and scared me. But it was never like a feeling of evil or wrong. It was just the experience itself that I was uncomfortable with. But after the hand on my shoulder, I believe my dad kept visiting me, but he would sit on the edge of my bed, almost at the foot of my bed. And there were so many nights that I would wake up and I would be aware that I'm awake, but I would feel the shift, the slight move of a person sitting on my bed. And I was always wondering, who is this? Am I really feeling this? Am I really awake? And I was. And I also wondered why my dog Mika wouldn't alert me that somebody was sitting on my bed, but he would never move. And I could just feel the indent of just somebody sitting and watching me. And over time, I got more comfortable with the feeling. And it happened a little less and less as time went on while I was living with my family. But every few years, it would kind of increase in frequency. But the last time that he visited me was really special. And nothing was really different, but it had been a few years since I had felt him visit. I was living with my partner at the time, and I had 2 dogs, and my life was stressful and busy. But it was the night before his birthday, and I remember missing him a lot this past year and missing the frequency of his visits and wondering why he wasn't visiting me anymore. Because over the years, I got more and more comfortable and I got more and more aware of who it was, why they were there, and that it was just my dad letting me know that he was there and that he'd always be there. But so the night before his birthday, I just remember waking up and I felt him sit on the edge of my bed. And again, I could feel that light shuffle of him sitting down, and I can feel the indent next to me. And it was brief, and nothing else happened. But I just remember being so grateful that he had visited me, especially the day before his birthday, because my sister and I had a falling out, and I was really missing her and really missing him. And it was just a really special visit because of the time in my life that was really difficult for me. But he's still there. I don't get too many visits like that anymore. I live in a new place. I live alone. I think he comes to me in slightly different ways. But there was one instance that may or may not have been him. Jury is still out. I was laying in my bed one night with my partner, and she had gotten up to go into another room just for a split moment. And it was pretty late at night. I want to say around 9 o'clock. So the sun was down completely. It was pitch black outside. And our window was open. And the window was probably about 2 feet away from my side of the bed. And I have glasses that I wear every day. And this night I was sitting up in bed and we had paused our TV so she could go into the other room and get something. And I was just sitting there kind of looking at my hands and my fingernails with my glasses off when something at the window caught my eye. And I remember looking at it, and it was this beach ball sized orb, completely and totally white, with no distinct features of any kind. I just remember seeing it kind of fuzzy in the window. It was pressed up against the glass as far as you can go. And I remember looking at it for a moment with my glasses off and thinking, what am I looking at? And then I look back down at my hands, and then I look back up at the window, and I see it, and it's still white, and it's still pressed up against the glass. And my mind can't understand what I'm looking at, because outside of our window, there was only stairs. We lived on a slope, and so our house had a back deck that our bedroom opened up to, and then stairs immediately down from that deck. So our window overlooked all the stairs. There was no deck that you can stand on. There was no windowsill that you could stand on. So if somebody or something was that close to the glass window, you would have to be either really tall or not at all. So I looked at it the second time, and then I thought, I need to put my glasses on and see what this is. And so really quickly, I grab my glasses and I look back at the window, and all I see is pitch black night. And so I get up really quickly and I go to the window, and there's nothing, just darkness. And in that moment, my partner comes back into the room, and as she does, she turns off the hall light, and I tell her, turn that back on. There's something out the window. And she's confused, but I go from our bedroom to our guest bedroom that leads out into the deck, because there's 2 exits, one in our bedroom that we didn't use, and then one in the back room. So I go out and I turn on the back porch light, and I frantically look outside, and I'm looking for a white cat. I'm looking for a person, and there's nothing. We have a back gate that is locked, that's really hard to open. So if anything or anybody came through, we would have to hear it, because you have to put a lot of pressure into opening the back gate. And there was no way that anything like a white Persian cat could sit on to get that close to our window. And there was no person, and there was no animal, and there was no light that would produce the same white orb that I saw outside of my window. And I will admit, I was really freaked out. I cried a little bit because I knew what I saw, but I just couldn't understand it. And I remember being a little in disbelief, and I still sometimes am today. But when I think about it, there is no other explanation. This was an orb. And I had never seen anything with my physical eye before, other than one apparition years prior, and nothing like this. No white orb have I ever seen. It was huge. It was so white. It was pure white. And I don't know what it was, but I don't think that it was anything sinister. And I don't know why it appeared to me visually, but it did. And I like to believe that it was my dad because he was such a good person and he's come to me so many times before. I just wish I had been more calm in the moment and not so afraid, because I wish that I had just sat with it and looked at it and understood in that moment that I was looking at it what it wanted to communicate. But I like to think that it was my dad. I've had other similar experiences in my life. Things have disappeared and reappeared. When I was a kid, I would also feel somebody sitting down next to me while I would watch TV. I'm not quite sure who that was because I was very young, probably about 6 or 7. I always have lights flicker wherever I go. It doesn't matter if it's a brand new building, a brand new home, brand new lights, light bulbs. Wherever I go, lights flicker. And like I said, things move on me almost playfully. I'll be looking for something and I'll look everywhere. I'll look very thoroughly and I'll know for a fact that I could not find what I was looking for in that specific spot. And then a moment later, I will return and it'll be right there in front of me. And that's very playful, and I don't get afraid of that because I just know it's somebody playing with me. And in my apartment now where I live, as I'm telling you this, I've had like an actual loofah, like the kind that you wash your body with, but it's in its true form, its first form, when it comes off the vine and you dry it, it still had its skin on the outside and it had the seeds inside. And my mother had grown these in her garden and she had given me 2 of them. And I was waiting for them to finish drying. So I put them on top of my refrigerator, kind of like the yin-yang symbol. So they were both sitting snugly together. And they were pressed up against a couple of the things that I had on top of my fridge. And they were basically in the middle of the refrigerator on top. So they couldn't move without me moving them. There was no air blowing. There was no knocking of them. But I'm on the phone with my mother. I'm standing in my kitchen on the right side of my kitchen, and my fridge is on the far left side of my kitchen. And we're talking probably about 10 feet. And as I'm on the phone with her one day, just out of the blue, one of these loofahs flies from the refrigerator all the way to the right side of the kitchen where I'm standing, right behind me, as if somebody chucked it. Like somebody chucked it off of the refrigerator. It didn't fall off and bounce. It flew. And I was so taken that I was just a tiny bit scared because nothing had happened in my apartment before this. But in a way, it was playful, like the other things, the moving of my things, the flickering of the lights, very playful things. So I tried not to get too scared about it, but I was just amazed and almost excited that this activity was starting up again, because I do look at it as a sign from my dad that he's still around. And even though I let him know, don't scare me, you can play, but don't scare me. Don't switch the lights on and off anymore because that freaks me out. But you can play and you can move things. You can, throw loofahs off of my refrigerator as long as you don't scare me. But I feel like I've always been more sensitive in my life than maybe I've realized. But it's changed my entire life. And it's a big part of who I am and the things that I think about every day. I think about him every day and I talk to him every day, even though I might not always get those signs from him or those visitations. From time to time, I will. And I don't feel scared about them anymore. I'm interested and I'm observant and I'm patient and quiet because I try to just hear the things that he might want to say, or just the little signs that there is more than what we can see, and there's more than just this life. So I know this might be pretty long, but I just wanted to share that with you because it's really special to me. And whenever I can share this with somebody and whoever's open to hearing it, I like to tell them these stories, especially the dreams that I had, the visitations, my dreams from my dad. Those I hold so dear because I was able to say goodbye and he was able to tell me that he's still here and that we shouldn't be afraid of death. We should welcome it when it's our time, and we shouldn't be afraid of what comes next because it's beautiful. And we might not understand it right now, but knowing all of this and knowing that afterlife can be so beautiful makes you really appreciate this life and the things you have now and the people, more importantly, you have now. So if you listen to this, thank you for listening for so long. It might sound a little silly, but in my bones, I know it's true. And I don't embellish anything. Every detail was truth. And I hope that if this helps anybody, then I'm happy to have shared it. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your podcast because I listen to it often, and it's always a joy to listen to everybody's stories and thoughts on what comes next.
Ayla, I just know that your stories are going to help someone listening right now. And your father is clearly a beautiful soul. And I want to thank you for sharing a bit of him with us. Next up is Melissa. And I'm sharing Melissa's story next because there are some interesting similarities between her and Ayla's experiences. So you two ladies might need to talk.
Okay. One night I crawled into bed and I was exhausted. So I just rolled over and was just about to fall asleep. And I felt behind me somebody sit on the edge of my bed and rest their hand on my leg. I'm sure you know what that feels like. Somebody sits on the edge of your bed and you feel the mattress, squish down and your bed jiggle a little bit. So it definitely startled me. It didn't feel threatening or scary, so I wasn't scared, but it was definitely startling. I live alone. I don't have pets. Nobody should be sitting on my bed, resting their hand on my leg. Eventually, I fell back to sleep. And the next day, I went over to my mom's house and I found her. She had passed away that night before. And of course, I was in a state, so I didn't put the two together. But weeks later, I was talking with a friend of mine, and I had remembered that happened. So I was telling her the story. And as I was telling her the story, it kind of took my breath away. I remembered that my mom, years prior, had told me the story that she was in bed one night and she got woken up by that feeling of somebody sitting on the edge of her bed and resting their hand on her leg. And when she got up the next day, she found out that her mom had passed that night. So at that point, I knew it was my mom because I knew she would know that I would remember that story because we had talked about it a lot. So I think she did it on purpose just to say goodbye. I 100% convinced that it was my mom who sat on my bed and rested her hand on my leg.
Now we're going to hear from Bruce. I get to talk to Melissa and Bruce fairly often in the Patreon Paranerd parties that I host monthly for Patreon supporters. But I think Bruce has attended every single one of them, and he is the life of the party. I've enjoyed getting to know Bruce and learning about his work as an evidential medium. In part 2, he'll be back to share a few stories that are more personal and from family experiences. But for now, here are 2 stories from his work with clients and also from a development group that he's participated in.
This is a story about past loved ones. I am an evidential medium, and this occurred probably in the 1990s. And it stayed with me because it's an example of what happens when you've got the privilege of passing on messages from loved ones who are passed to those who are living. So, okay, I'll set the scene. With evidential mediums in Australia, we sometimes go to development groups. And in these development groups, we usually have like-minded people sitting around and we practice with each other. So we met on a Wednesday night, and the lady I was doing a reading for, I was standing up and I said, okay, next to you I've got a boy, and he presents as 12 and he's switching between 17. So that indicates that he knew your family 12 to 17. So at that stage, I didn't know if it was a family member or a friend. So anyhow, I said, okay, he's presenting to me, but he's showing me a car crash. And the car crash, it's a stolen vehicle, because I can see the police pursuit of the vehicle, his impact to the pole, and he died. And I noticed that the police are there and the ambulance are there, and they're discussing the tragedy of the event. And there were a few other things which I passed on. For example, there was some comment about a passenger, and that was a bit unclear, was whether the passenger was with him or the passenger was survived. So anyhow, at the end of the reading, the woman said, yes, I know who you're talking about. He was a friend of my son, and he died in a car accident. But when we were practicing mediumship, we would look for the hits. So when I bring through a message, if there's a lot of hits, it's a high percentage. If it's a reasonable number of hits, it's a low percentage. So we try for names and all sorts of things as proof of survival. Well, she gave me a rating of about 60%, and she said, okay. And we met the next Wednesday, and she said, I was going to have a word to you about the reading you gave me last time. And she said, you were incorrect with a few things at the time. And what happened was that you said it was a stolen vehicle and that there was this car crash. And she said, you were right about the car crash, but the family had not mentioned anything to anybody about the stolen vehicle side. They wanted to keep things quiet, and families do that. And she said there's a few other things that, yes, there was a passenger who was supposed to be there but wasn't. She was the girlfriend and she didn't want to get into the car. And so anyhow, that was correct as well. So the percentage went from 60% to about 85%. Now, what was interesting was the following week, she came in and so she said, I approached the family and I was going to pass on the message from their son saying, he was sorry about his reckless actions, I suppose. And the family rejected the message because they felt it was coming from somebody. They didn't believe it. Their faith precluded them from believing that there were messages unless they were evil. And the next week, I got a message from the same lad, and what he wanted was to be remembered at Christmas. And I remember this. He said, "Could you put a star on the Christmas tree? Because I always loved your Christmases at your place." And she said, yes, she would. And that was the thing, was when you're passing on messages from loved ones, you don't know what the impact of the message is and how it's going to be received. But a lot of times they just want to be remembered, and they want to be, when we read the messages, we're reading messages of love. That's why it's a privilege to do so. Patrick, you're probably wondering why I remember this particular case from 30 years ago. And that's a very good question, because what happened is I saw the first responders having a conversation about the tragedy that had just happened. They weren't chasing a criminal. They were just there because a young lad had died, and they had children of their own, and their discussions were observed by the spirit of the lad. And it was the power of the emotions that sort of stayed with me, because I can still visualize it. And it's a bit like NDE when they sort of observe from as a distant position. So these first responders were just so upset. And when you do mediumship, you pick up emotions, and you find that these emotions are very powerful, and they register on you in the same way. So I feel that I'm speaking on the behalf of the ones who've passed, and maybe their story is different to other people's stories, but it's their story. They want to get their message across, and it's always been the requirement for a good medium is to pass on the message. You don't understand what it is. You don't know the significance of it. You don't know what's going to happen as a result of it. But it's always that you pass it on as best you can. Now, sometimes, as in this case, it was unexpected, because what saddened me was that when somebody comes through to give a message, I was used to grandfathers giving messages to their grandchildren, and they're always messages of love. And this one was not sort of well received. So those are the reasons that it stayed with me for so long. There's another story that I like to tell, and it's a story that sort of made an impact on me. And it was part of that training I explained, that sort of when we do platform work, where we stand in front of an audience and sort of we come to various people and bring the messages through, you need a bit of rehearsal before you are released into a live audience situation. And one of those training sessions, they brought in various people that we didn't know, and I remember I looked across, and there was this lady, probably about 20 years younger than me. And I remember she had a very lovely face, and I thought, well, that's good, because obviously the people that were wanting to communicate with her would be just as lovely as she would. Anyhow, I started, and I go, look, I've got your father with me, but I'm not sure if he's your father, because normally I can feel the love between people, and it's a very tangible feeling. And so this was a cold, empty feeling. And I said, look, I don't know if it's somebody saying that he's your father. And she said, no, that's my father. And I said, but it's so cold. I mean, and she said, no, he walked out on us when I was very young. I haven't spoken to him since, and I don't want to speak to him now. So at that point, the father who had passed broke contact, and I still remember the coldness of that contact. And it was always that when we're passing on messages from those who passed, the loved ones, it's the communication by love that's the important thing. The love is the method we connected to. So that taught me that sort of there has to be a way of scanning for those who have passed and locking in onto the love frequency, I suppose. And it's quite easy. What I used to do is not do wild guesses about who was standing behind them. I just picked the one who was shining the most with the love, and you could spot them. The ones that around them, there was the love, but there's somebody on the other side with that same frequency of love. That sort of it reinforced the connection.
Our final listener story for part 1 today is from Sherri. Her voice might sound familiar to you because it was just a few episodes ago that I interviewed her along with 2 other members of the Mourning Society of St. Louis.
Hi, Patrick. This is Sherri, your friend and devoted Paranerd. I'm calling to tell you about how I received a message from my dear grandmother. She passed in 2012. She was 100 years old and just the most amazing person I'd ever met in my life. She was loved dearly by everybody. And on her memorial service, I had made a copy of some of her favorite recipes because she was very well known for her baking to give out to family and friends that came to the memorial. Well, my sister and I were just missing her something terrible. And so we were trying to decide what to do about trying to honor her and maybe ask for a sign from her. And she had received the name of a psychic. Now, we were a little apprehensive because we'd never been to a psychic before and we didn't really know what to expect. So we had decided that we were going to make an appointment and go for it. So we did. So we get to our appointment with the psychic, and he immediately turns to us and says, "Oh, you 2 ladies just lost your grandmother, didn't you?" And we're like, "Yeah, we lost her about a year ago." And he says, "And you have all of her recipes," and points right at me. And I said, "Yeah, I do have her recipes." And he goes, "She says you've been having trouble with one of them." I said, "Well, for Thanksgiving, I did try to make one of her Texas cakes, which is one of her dishes that she's well known for." And I said, something was off about it. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was driving me quick. I couldn't put my finger on what was off about the Texas cake. It didn't taste like hers. And he goes, "She says that you can't make this low fat." And I'm like, low fat? And he said, "Yeah." She says, "You didn't use the Crisco." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I didn't. You're supposed to grease the pan with Crisco when you make this cake, and I used cooking spray." And she called me out on it. She used the psychic to call me out on not using the Crisco. So I have always used the Crisco every time since then, and it's turned out perfect. I hope that made you smile as much as it did me.
Well, Sherri, I don't bake much, but I'm going to remember your dear grandmother every time I see Crisco. Well, Paranerds, I hope you enjoyed these stories, and I hope they find their way to people who may need to hear them. And I also hope that they've inspired a few of you to consider reaching out with your own story. Just look in the show notes for this episode or visit bigseance.com/247 to learn how to do that. And if something happens, you'd like to reach out to any of the listeners who shared stories today, as long as they're open to it, I don't mind forwarding those messages along to them. You can email me at patrick@bigseance.com. We'll see you all soon for part 2 and so many more stories. And as always, right after the outro, I'll share some love for my Patreon supporters. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of Paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/big seance. Sue, Jen, Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne-Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Josiel Lorenzo, and Susan Davey. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Anne Rekovich from ozparatech.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Janae Michaels from Grey House Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Amy Park Gedicke of amyparkg.com, Lonnie Scott from weirdwebradio.com, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Midge Munster from midgemunster.com, Heather N. of dancingbeealchemy.com, Diane Razmataz, Stephen St. Amour, Tracy, Andrew Watson, Amy Taylor, Danielle Hemberry, Christine Rath-Selhe, Mindy Kentop, Hope Battaglia, Cass and Bailey, Melissa Armour, Janet Shaw-Binns, Bruce Williams, and Christopher Kohler. And I currently have 4 fabulous listeners who support the show at the $10 level, which, as you know, isn't even a thing. Those paranerds are Glenna Becker, Peggy Hagan, and Steve and the lovely Judy Skinner. I also have 3 wonderful listeners who support the show at the completely made-up $20 level. And those peeps are Norman and Linda Keller and Kevin Gilbert. Thank you, paranerds.